The Chancellor, Julian Vance, felt a familiar weariness settle over him as Eleanor Thorne looked at him from across the grand study, her expression a mask of elegant disdain. He knew what she was thinking. He was told he was not only slight of frame but also inadequate. The insult, delivered with quiet precision, still found its mark. Julian felt the heat rise in his cheeks, a man's pride being a fragile thing. He informed her that he was sending her to the country estate, effective immediately. Eleanor merely offered a chilling smile. She reminded him that her brother, Silas, was due back in Commonwealth City in 3 days. The mention of his name was enough to make Julian's resolve falter. He had to admit, his hold on power was perhaps not as firm as he pretended. His entire position was secured by his willingness to be propped up by others. Eleanor had agreed to their political marriage because she found the drama of a brother and sister both desiring the same man to be a uniquely thrilling game. Her brother, after all, harbored a long-standing and poorly concealed affection for Julian. This tangled alliance had its roots 2 years prior. Julian's father, Arthur Vance, had driven himself to the brink of collapse with the endless paperwork and political maneuvering of his office. He'd looked over at Julian, then 33 and content to observe the gardens of the residence, and exploded with frustration. Arthur had raged about his son's lack of ambition, how at his age he was still just the heir, not even bothering to plot a takeover, as if the chancellors of the Commonwealth were immortal. And so, Arthur had scrawled a letter of succession, shoved it into Julian's hands, and transferred the crushing weight of leadership onto him. He declared that from that moment on, Julian Vance was the chancellor. Julian had tried to protest, pointing out that no sane person would want the punishing schedule of the office. His father had picked up the heavy, ornate desk seal and hurled it at his head. With the deed done, Arthur had swept out, collecting Julian's mother on his way to a long-overdue retirement, leaving Julian rubbing the lump on his forehead and staring at the mountains of correspondence that now owned his life. The political landscape at the time was treacherous. His younger brothers, upon hearing he hadn't even wanted the position, packed their bags and fled the capital, reportedly debating amongst themselves why their unambitious older brother would suddenly stage a coup. His fourth brother, stationed in the Northern Territories, somehow got word and refused to return, no matter how much Julian pleaded. A message from Julian stating their father had passed was met with a cynical reply inquiring where the body was hanging and telling Julian to hurry up and take it down. Within the Commonwealth government, Leland Croft, the senior advisor and a veteran of 3 administrations, had greeted Julian with a smile that promised nothing but pain. On Julian's first day, Croft had verbally dismantled him, then asked if he conceded. Julian, utterly overwhelmed, had conceded immediately. He was the new chancellor. He had an image to maintain. Croft had shot back, asking if he truly believed he had an image left to protect. Julian would have had the man removed, were it not for his advanced age and the certainty that he wouldn't be a problem for much longer. Meanwhile, the commander of the powerful southwestern military bloc, a man with 200,000 soldiers at his disposal, took the opportunity to smile a predator's smile at Julian. He asked about the possibility of an alliance, noting he had a son and a daughter of marrying age. If Julian agreed, he would even help him handle the belligerent senior advisor. Julian, still reeling from Croft's tirade and seeing the commander's hardened face, foolishly believed the man was an expert at confrontation. He agreed, taking the man's daughter, Eleanor, as his wife. It was a package deal. Only after the wedding did he learn that her brother, Silas Thorne, was also part of the bargain, in a sense. On their wedding night, Eleanor had attempted to push Silas on him as well, suggesting Julian take them both if he wasn't opposed. Julian had cut her off, stating his opposition quite clearly. Undeterred, Eleanor had mused that in a world of dazzling temptations, unconventional arrangements held the most power. Julian told her to be direct if she simply didn't want to consummate the marriage, rather than inventing bizarre scenarios. As it happened, he lacked any conventional desires himself. The next month, however, Eleanor found her opportunity. She brought Silas before him. Julian remembered the day vividly. The sky was clear, the air soft, and the gardenias were in full bloom across the estate. He had reached his own breaking point with paperwork and had escaped to the countryside. He was searching for a suitable axe, intending to take out his frustrations on an ancient, stubborn oak tree, but his security detail was proving useless. Just as he was about to unleash his temper, a hand offered him an axe. Julian turned and found himself looking at Silas Thorne. He and Silas were semi-acquainted. They had met a few times years ago, back when Julian still had a shred of decorum. The commonwealth his father inherited had been in turmoil for over a decade, a legacy of his grandfather's decadent rule. Powerful families had risen, regional governors rebelled, and the rival Southern Syndicate had capitalized on the chaos. His grandfather, listening to corrupt counselors, was ready to cede territory to the syndicate before a single shot was fired. His father, Arthur, had seen enough and staged his own takeover, seizing power and declaring a new era. But this act only fueled the flames, and other regional powers rose in rebellion. Julian was 16 at the time, spending his days with Caleb Frost, the second son of the legendary Marshal Frost. Arthur Vance and Marshal Frost were childhood friends. Their bond so strong that when Arthur decided to seize power, the Marshal was the one who secured the capital for him. Afterward, Arthur had proudly told Julian that a man must have his own power base. Julian had agreed, and subsequently spent even more time at the Frost family compound. Unlike his father, Julian had no ambition. He was simply drawn to Caleb's striking looks, or rather, to the fluid grace Caleb displayed in a fight. The Frost family lineage traced back 10 generations of the Commonwealth's greatest protectors, their name a symbol of stability for the common people. Caleb had been on military campaigns with his father since he could walk. 3 years Julian's senior, he was already a renowned young commander by the time Arthur took power. He was a prodigy, brilliant in both strategy and combat, a fact that made him the standard by which all other young men in the capital were judged. Arthur had once asked the Marshal if he'd be willing to trade his 3 other sons for Caleb. The Marshal had told him to get lost, complaining that Julian practically lived at his house already. He remarked that while Julian wasn't bright, he was at least easy on the eyes, and he had no desire for 3 more Vance boys to give him an ulcer. He had finished by pointedly asking the Chancellor to act like a decent human being. Julian, standing nearby, had witlessly nodded in agreement, telling his father to be a decent human being. To avoid the beating that was sure to follow, Julian had grabbed the Marshal's sleeve as he left, asking if it was true that Caleb was leading an expiation in a few days. The Marshal, confused, had confirmed it. 3 days later, Julian was riding out with Caleb's column. Caleb's mission was to suppress a rebellious governor in the south, a route that took them through the Thorne family's territory. Back then, the Thorne lands were a veritable fortress, and Caleb needed their permission to pass or risk a fight he didn't have time for. Such was the fractured state of the Commonwealth. Caleb, wanting a swift campaign, sent Julian and a vanguard of 3,000 cavalry ahead to formally request a meeting with the head of the Thorne family. That was the first time Julian saw Silas Thorne. He was only 12, small in stature but immense in arrogance. He glanced at Caleb, then at Julian, and declared loudly to his father that one day he would replace the great Caleb Frost and have that beautiful man at his side as his deputy. His father had clamped a hand over his mouth, apologizing profusely to Caleb for his son's insolence. Caleb, wishing to avoid conflict, had magnanimously waved it off. Julian, however, was less forgiving. After the campaign, he secretly had Silas abducted and soundly beaten. When Caleb found out, he had mocked Julian, remarking on how very impressive it was to pick on a child. Julian had nodded proudly, agreeing that he was indeed just that impressive. Caleb could only shake his head, muttering that Julian was a complete blockhead. 17 years later, Julian saw Silas again. He was no longer a small boy. Time had been a cruel sculptor, carving lines of stress and fatigue into Julian's own face. But Silas, at 29, looked as if he were still 18. His features were sharp, his skin unlined. It was infuriating. Julian's blood pressure spiked, and he had the immediate urge to beat him again. He took the axe from Silas, his first thought being to mar that perfect face, inventing a justification about the danger of handing a weapon to the chancellor. Before he could act, Silas dropped to one knee, his voice urgent. He reported that the Southern Syndicate's army was massing on the border. Julian, his mind clouded by Eleanor's recent provocations, adopted a sardonic, oily tone. He remarked that if Silas wanted to get his attention, he shouldn't resort to such cliché tactics as crying wolf. Silas hesitated, then seemed to decide against diplomacy. He urged his chancellor to switch off his romantic delusions. The syndicate was really attacking. 15 divisions were already bearing down on the southern territories. And then Julian remembered. It was the syndicate's standard operating procedure. Every time the Commonwealth had a change of leadership, they would test the waters. Julian also realized Silas hadn't been handing him an axe. He had simply knelt, and Julian's hand had brushed against the axe at his belt. Though he'd been an arrogant boy, Silas had indeed grown to replace Caleb Frost in stature. With the 200,000-strong Southwestern Army under his family's control, he had spent years leading them on his father's behalf, becoming the new brilliant young commander of the Thorn family, a bastion of strength and strategy. Unlike Julian, hearing the news, Julian's first instinct was to shout for his father to come back, that he couldn't handle it alone. Silas's expression tightened. Julian quickly remembered his parents were on an extended vacation and forced himself into a semblance of composure. He weighed the axe in his hand, considered the situation for a moment, and decided the most pressing matter was to fell the oak tree. Silas Thorn, who had arrived with an urgent military dispatch, ended up helping the chancellor haul timber back to the residence. Upon their return, Marcus, his father's old chief steward, gave Julian a look that suggested he hadn't been disciplined enough in his youth. Marcus lamented that at such a critical juncture, the chancellor chose to chop wood instead of convening an emergency council. He assured Julian that Leland Croft would undoubtedly be drafting a 10,000-word reprimand at that very moment. To forestall Croft's lecture, Julian summoned his advisors and made a bold declaration. He would lead the counterattack himself. He slammed his hand on the desk, waxing nostalgic about a past victory. He claimed the syndicate had grown arrogant, forgetting the time he and Caleb had beaten them so badly they'd lost their winter uniforms. It was time, he announced, for another lesson in humility. Leland Croft stared at the nearly manic chancellor, popped a nitroglycerin pill under his tongue, and pointed a trembling finger. He ordered him thrown out. Marcus dutifully dragged Julian from the room. In the end, the council decided Silas Thorn would depart immediately to command the defense. Eleanor saw her brother off at the city gates. When she returned, the look she gave Julian was one a person reserves for a useless freeloader. Julian, his authority usurped, was seething. But with the war in the south hanging in the balance, he couldn't risk dismissing her. Not when her brother was the Commonwealth's best general and her family controlled its strongest army. So he channeled his frustration into his woodwork, hacking away at logs in the residence gardens. Marcus watched him, sighing. He knew the chancellor was angry, but advised him to moderate his temper. The anger was real. Julian recalled a time before he was trapped by his title, when news of a syndicate invasion would send him and the council into a day of furious debate, after which he could join Caleb on a grueling march across mountains to deliver a crushing blow. That was in the 5th year of his father's rule. Arthur, through sheer effort and sleepless nights, had finally stabilized the fractured nation. Marshal Frost had ruthlessly purged the corrupt aristocracy, securing the government but suffering a debilitating back injury in the process. Just when Arthur thought he could finally rebuild, the syndicate had come again. 15 divisions, their lucky number it seemed. The news sent the council into a panic. His father, too, was shaken, on the verge of accepting fate. He'd superstitiously grabbed his spiritual advisor, weeping and asking if he was destined to be the man who lost the Commonwealth. The advisor, a stern old monk who had been his teacher, had barely restrained his disgust before kicking him in the rear and telling him to go cry to his son. So Arthur had hauled Julian, who was lounging at the Frost compound, into the palace along with Caleb, to argue with the council. The consensus among the ministers was to cut their losses and sacrifice the southern territories, hoping to reclaim them years later when the treasury was full. Julian argued that such a concession would only invite more demands from the syndicate. The ministers countered, speaking of the people's suffering and the toll of another war. Julian shot back, asking if the lives of the millions in the south didn't count as people. He pointed out the syndicate's resource-poor lands and predicted they would strip the South bare. But the council was unmoved, citing the empty treasury and the marshal's incapacitation. Who would lead? With what funds? Julian looked at Caleb, then at his own empty pockets, and made a decision. He declared that Caleb Frost would lead the army, and he himself would secure the funding. That silenced the council. Outside the chamber, Caleb had looked at him, asking where the money for his grand promise would come from. Julian told him not to worry. He would go sell himself on the street corner if he had to. Caleb had just rolled his eyes, unimpressed with the empty boast. But Julian had an idea. He summoned his network of wealthy friends, the sons of industrialists and financiers, to his private quarters. He painted them a grand picture of patriotic investment, promising them riches and influence once he led them all to victory. Sterling Hayes, the heir to the Commonwealth's largest fortune, had told him the vision was too grand to swallow. Julian had replied that if he didn't contribute, he'd personally show up at his house that night and force-feed him. In the end, Sterling, against the strenuous objections of his family, nearly liquidated his assets and strong-armed several other business leaders into becoming reluctant patriots. He had helped Julian raise the necessary funds with only one request: that Julian deliver a message to the syndicate that the Hayes family had wanted to crush them for a very long time. His own father had been murdered by syndicate soldiers while on a business trip in the south. After that, Julian and Caleb had spent half a year in the dust and grit of the southern territories, grinding the syndicate's army into submission. Just as Julian's borrowed funds were about to run out, the syndicate had surrendered. It was the most ferocious Julian had ever seen Caleb fight, leading charges from the front, utterly heedless of his own safety. After the battle, Julian counted the wounds on his friend: 5 deep cuts on his back, 3 on his chest, and an arrow that had pierced his thigh. Julian's conscience ached. He apologized, admitting that if he weren't so broke, Caleb wouldn't have had to fight with such desperation. It was true. The funds he'd scraped together were only enough for a 6-month campaign. Any longer and the army would have starved. At one point, when the syndicate refused to surrender, Julian had even dispatched an urgent message to Sterling Hayes, preparing to ask for more. Caleb, using his uninjured leg, had kicked him away and turned his wheelchair to face the wall, telling him that next time he wanted to play the hero, he should leave him out of it. He had no desire to lose his other leg just to save Julian's pride. Julian had protested that it was just a joke, that he would never actually debase himself for Sterling. If he were to sell himself, it would be to the Frost family. Caleb's back had stiffened. He turned, the setting sun catching the side of his face, igniting it in a way that took Julian's breath away. Julian had spoken without thinking, asking Caleb if anyone had ever told him that one shouldn't meet someone too remarkable when young. Caleb, seeing him pause, asked what would happen otherwise. Julian had stated with great conviction that otherwise, one becomes progressively more shameless. Caleb told him to get lost. When they returned to the capital, Caleb was still in a wheelchair, which Julian pushed into the Grand Assembly Hall for the victory report. It did nothing to diminish his formidable presence. The council members praised him, proclaiming that only a Frost could mend a broken world. Marcus, standing close to Caleb, had been the loudest, even adding a perfunctory compliment for Julian. But now, Marcus looked at Julian's log splitting and offered no such praise. Julian lamented how formidable he used to be, a killing machine alongside Caleb. Marcus dryly commented that Julian was responsible for the cackling. Julian insisted he didn't want to be a kept man. He wanted to earn respect. Marcus warned him he'd be struck by lightning. Annoyed, Julian told him to be quiet. But Marcus continued, attempting to console him by pointing out that he had relied on Caleb Frost for years, and now he was just relying on someone else. It was all the same. He then brought up Julian's father, who had seized power on impulse only to find it a burden, yet had managed to hold on. Now, the old man was enjoying a leisurely retirement, growing plump and sending letters asking Marcus to look after Julian. Realizing his slip, Marcus quickly changed the subject, suggesting that Julian could find a way to make his dependent position seem powerful. After all, it was still the Vance family's commonwealth. No one would dare look down on him. Julian considered it. There was some logic there. If the Thorne family grew too arrogant, he could always find a pretext to remove them. There were plenty of other powerful families. If they wouldn't let him rule with dignity, he'd simply replace them. With this resolve, as Silas was fighting for him on the front lines, Julian was in the capital, deliberately making his sister-in-law's life difficult. When Eleanor tried to discuss a letter from her brother about the war, Julian refused to look at it. When she suggested a retreat to the mountain lodge for the summer, he refused to go. When she brought up the council's suggestion that he take more wives to ensure an heir, he bluntly stated his disinterest. Tired of the games, Julian delegated his duties to Leland Croft and went hunting in the countryside. 5 months later, after Silas won his first major victory against the syndicate, Julian returned to the capital and promptly assigned a political overseer to Silas's command. He then sent a message: "Do not return until the syndicate's capital has fallen." His primary motivation was a desire to be part of the victory, to assert his own relevance. The council, however, was in an uproar. They argued that a commander should be trusted, not spied upon. Furthermore, the harvests had been poor. It was no time for a protracted, aggressive war. Julian retorted that he wasn't showing distrust, merely sending Silas some help. When they persisted, he turned their logic against them, asking if their suspicion of his motives meant they thought him incapable. He reminded them that a man cannot be called incapable, and boasted that with 100,000 men, he could take the syndicate's capital himself. The council, stymied, looked to Leland Croft. The senior advisor rummaged through his pockets and, finding no heart medication, adopted an expression of pure exhaustion. He advised the other ministers to abandon their heroic impulses and respect the course of fate. Pausing, he added that none of them wanted to be the ones sent to the Southern Territories to collect the Chancellor's body. Did they? That silenced them, but then Eleanor appeared. She, who had long romanticized the idea of Julian and her brother, knew his history better than anyone. She dispensed with subtlety and asked him directly if the tragedy of the past hadn't been lesson enough. Did he have no memory at all? Julian dismissed her, telling her not to bring up the past. It was just a minor mistake. She cut him off, her voice rising with urgency, questioning if he truly wanted to launch a full-scale invasion of the syndicate now, when the Commonwealth had only just found stability and risk losing. Before she could finish, Marcus interrupted. He calmly told the lady that he knew she was agitated, but she should calm herself. The Chancellor was simply trying to assert his authority over the council. He had no intention of undermining the Thorne family or sacrificing them. To add weight to his words, Marcus pointed to the captain of the guard and swore on the man's life that he was telling the truth. The captain, nonplussed, drew his sword and asked how the steward intended to respond if he produced said life. Before a fight could break out between the two, Eleanor left. Her words, however, had dredged up unpleasant memories for Julian. It was the 10th year of his father's rule. Arthur, on the verge of losing his last patch of hair from stress, had finally stabilized the Commonwealth. The nation was growing stronger. With no crises to manage, he had idled himself into illness. Refusing treatment, he superstitiously decided that Julian getting married would cure him. From his bed, he had wheezed at his son, reminding him he was 26 and it was time to settle down. He swore he would not die in peace if Julian remained unmarried. Julian, whose entire life had been consumed by fighting wars and bantering with Caleb Frost, had no prospects for a wife. So, he dutifully replied that when the time came, he would personally ensure his father's eyes were closed. The old man, miraculously cured by rage, sat up and threw a pillow at him. Julian thought for a moment and added that Caleb was 29 and still unmarried. Perhaps he should ask if Caleb would be willing to make do with him. His father, now fully recovered, leaped out of bed and chased him halfway across the residence, screaming that if he dared corrupt Caleb, he would disinherit him. Julian, not believing a word of it, stormed off to the Frost compound. He found Caleb studying maps of the small states bordering the syndicate and told him he needed him to agree to something, no questions asked. Caleb, without looking up, said no. Julian grabbed his sleeve, insisting it was an emergency, a matter of life and death. Caleb turned to look at him, and seeing the handsome line of his jaw, the courage Julian had brought with him evaporated. Leland Croft had been right. He knew the character of all the young men he had tutored. Julian truly had no shame, especially in the years he spent trailing Caleb. His friends and family had often questioned his sense of decorum. Caleb, annoyed, had once asked if he had anything better to do than follow him around. Julian had shamelessly replied that following Caleb was his proper business. Sterling Hayes, whose fortune had suffered for their campaigns, had asked if Julian thought his money grew on trees. Julian had agreed that the wind was indeed strong. His younger brother, after being extorted by Julian following a mistake, had asked how he could possibly accept his prized set of matching heirlooms after not only failing to defend him to their father, but actively making things worse. Julian had replied that he was teaching him a valuable lesson. It was no wonder his brothers hadn't returned to help him. But in that moment, facing Caleb, even the shameless Julian couldn't ask the question. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Caleb, unused to seeing him so subdued, found it novel. He turned fully, a playful look on his face, and teased him, asking if he'd hit his head, been diagnosed with a terminal illness, or if their father was finally forcing him into an arranged marriage. When Julian didn't react, Caleb laughed, the sound sharp and clear. It was the last one, wasn't it? The final suggestion, and the way he laughed so loudly stung Julian. He nodded, his expression deadly serious, and asked, "Would you be willing?" Caleb's smile froze on his face. He clearly thought Julian was joking again, but when Julian remained silent, the humor died in his eyes. After a long moment, he muttered that the chancellor was still ill. His own father's back was failing, and the Southern campaign was imminent. At such a critical moment, the heir to the Commonwealth had lost his mind. What a thrill! Julian, determined to get an answer, pressed him, asking if he wanted to add a little more excitement for the old men. Caleb stared at him for a long time, then uttered a single word: "Leave." Julian left, but then he went back. He found Caleb staring at the maps, held upside down in his left hand. In his right, he was fiddling with one of the matching vintage dog tags Julian had extorted from his brother, as if debating whether to throw it away. Julian reminded him that the set was worth 2 cities. It would be a shame to lose it. Caleb glanced at him and said fine, he'd sell it after the Southern campaign. Julian, furious but unable to win a physical fight with him, went back to the residence to torment his father. He shook the old man awake and told him that Caleb had said he'd wait until he was better before provoking him further. His father sputtered, but Julian was already gone, on his way to join Caleb for the Southern campaign. As he left the city, he sent a message back. Until the syndicate's capital fell, he would not return. Caleb had covered his mouth, him to be careful what he wished for. As it turned out, Caleb was right. One should not tempt fate. On that campaign, Julian nearly died on the battlefield. They lost 50,000 men, and Caleb truly did lose the use of his other leg. It was no wonder Leland Croft had him physically removed from the council when he'd suggested leading a campaign himself. As Marcus had secretly gossiped to a junior aide, without Leland, the chancellor would likely be dead. Julian saw Marcus shaking his head and felt a deep unease at how secrets traveled in this place. He was the chancellor, and yet gossip about him was everywhere. 3 months later, Silas had driven back the syndicate, but when Julian ordered him to press the attack, he refused to move. Julian sent 12 consecutive orders, each on a solid gold plaque. Not only were the orders ignored, but the gold was melted down and sold as trinkets. The man who intercepted the orders was none other than Leland Croft. He, along with the Treasury Secretary, came to see Julian. The secretary fell to his knees, thanking the chancellor for his generous donation to the state coffers. Leland presented an invoice. The gold had fetched 20,000 silver pieces. Julian was furious, declaring it was his private money. Leland scoffed, asking what kind of responsible leader used solid gold for messages, especially during a costly war. It was extravagant even for the most decadent tyrant. He declared the funds confiscated for the public good. Julian swallowed his anger and asked about his plan to attack the syndicate. Leland's own anger flared. He asked what kind of leader couldn't bear to see his subjects enjoy a moment of peace. Silas's father, the Old Thorn Patriarch, was over 50. Was Julian determined to make him see his own son buried? Julian, confused, pointed out that Croft and the Thorn Patriarch were rivals. Leland simply replied, yes. A dreadful thought occurred to Julian. Had he been played by both of them? Why? Marcus leaned in and whispered in his ear. It was because, at his advanced age, he had yet to produce an heir. The two of them had staged a years-long feud just to pressure him into marriage. It all made sense now. Ever since he had married Eleanor, Croft and the old Thorn had been seen playing chess together. In the council, Croft would berate him, and Thorn would add his solemn agreement. They had planned it all. Julian had been comprehensively fooled. He was so enraged he spent another month in the countryside, hunting and chopping wood. After a month, with rumors swirling that he was keeping a mistress in the country and neglecting his duties, Silas Thorn returned to the capital. He knelt in the great hall, clad in light armor. The council members went through the motions of praising him, using the same tired lines they had once used for Caleb Frost. But Julian was in a foul mood. He was determined to find fault. He remarked that it had taken nearly a year to deal with a minor power like the syndicate. At his words, the council members instinctively looked at Silas's father, who seemed ready to clamp a hand over his son's mouth. They clearly feared Silas would retort with, "If you think it's so easy, do it yourself." For anyone else, such insolence would mean demotion or execution. For Julian, it would mean he would actually go. Silas, however, was diplomatic. He didn't mention Julian ignoring his dispatches for supplies while he was away hunting. He didn't mention the disruptive overseer Julian had sent. He humbly replied that it was his own failure. But Leland Croft could not abide Julian's arrogance. As Julian prepared to criticize further, Croft jabbed him in the back. He told him to be satisfied. At least Silas had won. Had the Chancellor already forgotten his own disastrous campaign, where he had been soundly defeated and nearly lost his life in the south? Julian was speechless. This old man had to die today. He spoke the truth far too freely. But as Julian was about to order him arrested, Croft produced a writ of immunity signed by Julian's father. Julian could only fume. Perhaps it was time for a trip south to pay his respects to the old man. That night, influenced by Croft's words, Julian had a nightmare. He dreamt of that failed campaign. His father hadn't been pretending. He had been truly ill, delirious for months. Julian had been acting as regent. The syndicate, sensing weakness, had incited several neighboring states to join them in picking at the Commonwealth's corpse. Julian, young and full of fire, had decided that if they were so eager to poach, he would make them part of the flock. He would conquer them all and end the threat for good. But when he proposed this, the council had obstructed him at every turn, preaching peace and fiscal responsibility. He had gone to Caleb, asking if he was with him. Caleb's answer was simple: "Pay me." So Julian had gone to Sterling Hayes and asked if he believed in miracles. Sterling had produced the keys to all his vaults and asked what scale of miracle he had in mind. With their backing, the campaign was set. Just as they were preparing to depart, his father recovered. Julian rode out with Caleb once more. They were gone for 2 years, subjugating all the smaller states around the syndicate. Just as they were poised to strike the final blow, a traitor emerged from within their own ranks. Caleb was struck by a poisoned arrow inside his own command tent. It was meant to be fatal. He was unconscious for half a month before the army medics managed to save him. But the traitors had all committed suicide immediately after the attack, leaving no one to interrogate. The campaign was halted. During the retreat, another disaster struck. Syndicate forces, somehow already inside their borders, ambushed them. They lost 50,000 men. The small states they had just conquered immediately rebelled again. Julian and Caleb were cornered on a desolate mountain in the south, trapped for 7 days and nights without food or water. Julian had taken an arrow to the back and was burning with fever. In his delirium, he asked Caleb if, should they survive, he would refrain from selling that dog tag. Caleb had glanced at him, his voice dry. Was he not afraid of being disowned by his father? Julian had declared that a broken leg could be set. Caleb had touched his forehead. He told Julian his fever was making him delirious and that he should sleep. They would be back in the capital soon. Julian had felt a wave of despair, wondering if he should write a will. Before he could fall asleep, Caleb's voice cut through the haze, imperious and absolute. Be quiet, Julian Vance. Other men may leave their lives to fate, but your life is mine to decide. It wasn't the first time he'd been wounded fighting alongside Caleb. For 12 years, they had been constantly at war, stabilizing the nation his father had inherited. Julian was never without some injury, nor was it their first defeat. The old Marshal Frost, despite his back, had come to bail them out twice. After the first time, the Marshal had suggested to Arthur that it was reckless for the heir to be constantly on the front lines. Arthur had shot back, asking if the Marshal thought his son was expendable but Vance was not. The Marshal had grimaced, telling him his competitive streak was unhealthy. But this defeat was the most humiliating. They had been beaten not by the enemy, but by one of their own, and they didn't even know who. Yet, as Caleb had said, his life was not his own to lose. Caleb would not permit him to die. On the 7th day, a distress call reached the nearby Thorn family, who arrived with reinforcements and rescued them. They had recuperated at the Thorn estate for some time. According to Eleanor, it was during this period that Silas had developed his infatuation. Julian couldn't imagine what Silas saw in him then. He had been a wreck, filthy and feverish. Caleb, who had known him since childhood, had told him to keep his distance, that he didn't want to survive the battle only to be killed by the smell. He hadn't bathed in over 2 weeks, in the sweltering heat of July. When the old Marshal Frost finally arrived, he held his nose as he approached, not even recognizing his son's charge. He'd casually asked the medic treating Julian who the boy was, and if he could even be saved, given the stench. Perhaps Silas had a peculiar taste for derelicts. To get to the bottom of this, and to better position himself to be a kept man under Silas's protection, Julian had kept him in the capital after his return. Wary of the council's collective anxiety, he had claimed he needed to discuss plans for a new syndicate campaign with Silas. But Marcus had informed him this was even worse. The ministers now suspected he was planning to assassinate Silas, a classic case of discarding the tool once the job is done. Julian scoffed at the idea. He was well aware of his own limitations. The Thorns had 200,000 soldiers and had contributed immensely to the Commonwealth's stability. While they had remained neutral during his father's initial takeover, that was understandable. The Commonwealth had seemed on the verge of collapse. Many on the council had done the same. But once his father had solidified his power, the Thorns, like the others, had pledged their full support. Now they were a pillar of the state. Silas's reputation was approaching that of Caleb in his prime. Since arriving in the capital, the Thorn residence had been flooded with visitors. The city's elite flocked to him, much as they had to Caleb after his victories. Besides, Silas had saved his life. The debt of a life saved could only be repaid in one way. The idea seemed sound. Julian, never one for subtlety, chose a day with a pleasant ambience for a heart-to-heart and summoned Silas to the residence. He asked him directly, stating that he'd heard from Eleanor that Silas was so infatuated he was banging his head against the walls at home. What exactly did he like about him? Silas looked up, not at Julian, but at Eleanor, a question in his eyes. Julian was also puzzled. Did his wife have the answer written on her face? Silas considered for a moment, then gave a stiff, formal reply. He admired the chancellor's love for his people. It was so painfully official. Yet Eleanor reacted as if she'd had a revelation. She turned to her brother, exclaiming that it all made sense now. His overbearing, paternalistic attitude at home was because he was attracted to paternalistic men. If looks could kill, the glare Silas shot his sister would have been fatal. Eleanor had made a terrible mistake. Silas clearly had no romantic interest in him. He had told her that her indiscriminate matchmaking would lead to trouble, but she hadn't listened. Still, Eleanor refused to admit her error. She even encouraged Julian to engage in a bit of forceful persuasion with Silas to satisfy her own perverse hobby of mismatched pairings. She urged him to imprison him, to dominate him, to adopt a mantra of "it is better that I love no one than that the world not love me." Julian was speechless. He told her to have some shame. She retorted that shame couldn't be eaten. He remembered a time when she wasn't like this, when she was a demure and sensible girl. That was during the time he and Caleb were recovering at the Thorn estate. Eleanor was only 13 then, a girl-next-door type who spent her days engineering encounters with Caleb. She would drop a handkerchief or a book as he passed, yet never dared to look him in the eye. It was always Julian who had to pick up her things and call after her. The most egregious incident was when she had slipped and fallen directly in front of Caleb by an ornamental lake. Caleb, his legs still injured and unable to bend down, had simply taken 2 steps back. Julian had helped her up, telling her tiredly to give it up. Caleb was injured, and Julian couldn't swim. If she fell in the lake, no one could save her. She had fled in embarrassment. But she persisted. Julian, unable to watch any longer, took matters into his own hands. The next time she approached, he wrapped an arm around Caleb's waist, planted a kiss on his cheek, and told her that while she was strikingly beautiful, she was far too young for Caleb, who was not that kind of predator. Besides, he informed her, Caleb's romantic inclinations were the same as his own. They were simply not compatible. The girl's eyes had widened as if a new universe had opened up to her. She had stammered, asking if she could join them. It was such an audacious statement. As Julian was pondering how such a prestigious family could produce such a shameless and depraved child, she added that she had admired Caleb Frost for a long time and wanted him to be her mentor. Julian realized then that he was the shameless and depraved one. It made sense. Caleb had always been popular with the younger generation. Whenever he returned to the capital, the children of the elite would flock to the Frost compound, half wanting to be his apprentice, the other half just following the crowd. Caleb, who valued his peace, had tasked Julian with deterring them. Julian had employed psychological warfare, telling them they were already dim-witted, and studying under a genius like Caleb would only highlight their incompetence. Their parents could no longer make excuses for them. He'd asked them to consider their parents' blood pressure. As they hesitated, Julian, seeing Caleb walk away, had leaned in with a menacing grin and advised them to leave, unless they wanted a beating. It had worked. Julian had been proud of his success, only to find a new sign at the Frost gate. Beware of dog. The ink was still wet, the handwriting unmistakably Caleb's. Julian had chased him down, demanding to know what he meant. Caleb had calmly covered his mouth and told him to retract his fangs. Everyone knew he was territorial. During that incident at the Thorn estate, the old Marshal Frost had also happened to arrive at that exact moment. The scene was excruciatingly awkward. After a long silence, Caleb had finally addressed his father. The Marshal, furious, had sputtered that he had no son like him. It was Eleanor who had saved them, explaining that the chancellor had thought she was interested in Caleb and had staged the display to make her give up. The marshal, skeptical, had looked from Julian to Caleb, asking if it was true. Caleb had paused, then told his father that for the sake of his blood pressure, he should believe the young lady for now. The marshal had left, muttering about digging graves for his ancestors. After he was gone, Eleanor had looked at Caleb with her wide, innocent eyes and asked if she could be his apprentice now. Caleb had politely declined, stating that the chancellor wouldn't approve. After that, Eleanor had stopped her attempts on Caleb. She had been such an obedient girl then. How had she changed so much? She simply said that a girl changes. Thinking back on her recent behavior, Julian asked if she meant she'd changed for the worse. But Eleanor, perhaps truly mad from her matchmaking hobby, had become relentless in her efforts to pair Julian with her brother. She had fed him a constant stream of information about Silas's habits, achievements, and philosophies, trying to create a comprehensive profile for Julian. She praised his wealth, his fighting prowess, his popularity. Through her, Julian learned that Silas had been the true power in the Thorn family since he came of age, that he had built their fortune, and that he'd once come into a mysterious windfall of cash. He also learned that Eleanor and Silas had different mothers. Julian had looked at her wryly, remarking on their deep sibling bond, so deep that she would offer up her own husband and act as a matchmaker for her brother. Eleanor had given him a look that said, "You know exactly why." She was blaming him. Julian remembered his own preferences. He felt a grim certainty that if the Thorn family ever fell, or if Silas were ever betrayed, Eleanor would be at the heart of it. He also felt that something was missing from her appearance. So he had a magnificent emerald coronet made and presented it to her. To avoid disappointing Eleanor completely, Julian had continued to summon Silas to the residence, ostensibly to discuss the war, but really just to keep up appearances. While Eleanor was busy trying to give her husband to her brother, the council was busy trying to get Julian to produce an heir. Leland Croft led the charge, sending 3 memos a day with the same message. To ensure prosperity, one must have more children and plant more trees. Julian had retorted that the last time Croft was ill, his 5 sons had nearly come to blows over the inheritance. The Thorn patriarch had chimed in about the importance of continuing the line. Julian had told him to be quiet, as he was on the verge of being usurped by his own son. When Marcus tried to speak, Julian had cut him off, informing him that his adopted son had been complaining that Marcus's recent sick leave was actually a jaunt out of the city. Marcus, after a moment of stunned silence, had clarified that he was only asking if the Chancellor's birthday next month would be celebrated outside the residence, as it was last year. Julian had forgotten. His brothers, seeing he had no intention of abdicating in their favor, had returned to the capital, claiming they wanted to celebrate with him. But now Julian looked at Marcus suspiciously, asking if he'd been paid off by the protocol office. Marcus produced a 100 silver note, explaining that the head of protocol had praised his ability to withstand verbal abuse and had asked him to inquire about the birthday arrangements. Julian, disinterested, gave his permission for Marcus to take a half-day, who then rushed off, claiming he had to go discipline his ungrateful son. The real reason the protocol office was afraid to ask Julian directly was because his birthday was also the anniversary of Caleb Frost's death. They feared triggering his grief. That was in the 15th year of his father's reign. Julian had revived his plan for a southern campaign, determined to subjugate the syndicate once and for all. His father had asked if he was so desperate to avoid marriage that he would perpetually antagonize their neighbors. He'd lectured him on the importance of settling down before building a legacy. Julian had replied that he was about to go ask Caleb when they could get married. His father had dropped the papers he was holding. Julian had cheerfully repeated that since he had no fiancée, and Caleb had already accepted his proposal, the matter was settled. Arthur, livid, had stormed out to confront Marshal Frost, who had simply reminded him of his old offer to trade 3 sons for 1. The 2 old men had a massive argument, which ended with the Marshal declaring that Arthur shared the blame for not supervising his own son, whom he had left in the Marshal's care. He'd reminded Arthur that he had warned him against letting the boys go to war, but Arthur had insisted his son was as expendable as the Marshal's. Now that the boy was warped, Arthur couldn't blame him. Arthur had seized on the key point. The Marshal had known about them all along. The Marshal fell silent. He had, in fact, been present 6 months prior when Julian had formally confessed his feelings to Caleb. It was on the night of a festival. Julian had dragged the reluctant Caleb onto a boat to release lanterns on the river. After the lanterns, they had stayed on the water, drinking. When Caleb was sufficiently intoxicated, Julian had attempted to play a notoriously difficult love song on a zither. He was so bad at it that it had instantly sobered Caleb up, who had lunged forward to silence the strings, demanding to know what was wrong with him. Looking into Caleb's handsome face, so close to his own, Julian had felt a surge of emotion and confessed his love. After his first, less serious proposal, Caleb had maintained an ambiguous stance, never initiating but never refusing. He allowed Julian to kiss him, to hold his hand, and he had never sold the dog tag. But he had never spoken a word of his own feelings. Julian had been determined to get an answer that night. Caleb had looked at him, his expression unreadable, and after a long moment, sighed. He had asked Julian what it was he saw in him. As Julian was preparing to list the many reasons, Caleb had leaned in and kissed him. The kiss was long and deep. When it ended, Caleb had seemed to surrender. He said it didn't matter, and then, his voice low, he had answered him, "I love you, Julian Vance." Just as he spoke, there was a splash. They looked over to see Marshal Frost flailing in the river. As he swam away, he had shouted that Julian played very well, but should never play again. Now, facing Arthur's accusations, the Marshal had deflected, pointing out that Arthur must have noticed something was amiss between the 2 boys who were always in his presence. His failure to intervene was a tacit approval. The 2 old men had realized they had both been hoping the other would deal with the situation. After they had departed in a huff, Julian had pressed Caleb, asking when they would marry now that their fathers had implicitly consented. Caleb had demurred, suggesting they wait until after the Southern campaign. But the campaign never happened. A month before their planned departure, at Julian's birthday celebration, assassins struck. Caleb had thrown himself in front of Julian, taking a poisoned arrow meant for him. The assassins' methods, their movements, were identical to those of the traitors in the army. Seeing their primary target safe, they had all taken poison and died. The poison on the arrow was the same as before. This time, however, Caleb could not be saved. He lingered for 2 weeks, then died. His death devastated the old Marshal, aging him decades overnight. He contracted pneumonia, and after a few days of coughing, he surrendered his command and retired to the countryside. Arthur, fearing a concentration of military power in hands he didn't trust, broke up the Frost army. Some went to the south, some were absorbed into the capital guard, but the largest portion became the Southwestern Army, now under the control of the Thorn family. 3 years had passed. The glory of the Frost family, like Caleb himself, had faded into history. The identity of the assassins remained a mystery, a time bomb waiting to detonate under Julian's rule. The detonation came 3 days later. Julian had once again summoned Silas to discuss the syndicate campaign against the objections of his council. On his way back from the residence, Silas was attacked. He was stabbed 3 times. The assailants were Julian's own Capitol guards, men who had once served under Caleb Frost. One was captured. His confession was clear. He claimed Julian had ordered the hit because he was angry that Silas had refused to launch an immediate invasion of the syndicate. It was true that Silas had argued against the plan that day, citing the poor harvests and the strain on the treasury. The Justice Ministry, not daring to make the matter public, had woken Julian in the middle of the night to present the confession. The next day, the Great Hall exploded in outrage. Ministers demanded a full investigation. If a high-ranking commander could be attacked in the capital, who was safe? Was the Chancellor next? Julian, for his part, just wished they wouldn't jinx him. He still had plans. He put on a show of firm resolve, promising a thorough investigation and even dismissing the captain of the guard to prove his sincerity. But the memos continued to flood his office. For 10 days, he was buried under an avalanche of paper. Then the rumors began. The investigation was stalled because Julian was secretly obstructing it. It was he who wanted Silas dead. Combined with the earlier suspicions that he had kept Silas in the capital to eliminate him, the story was dangerously plausible. Someone had leaked the fact that the Justice Ministry had visited him in the middle of the night. Now, even the official historians looked at him as if he were a tyrant in the making. Julian felt trapped. He was about to flee the residence when Eleanor knelt before him, weeping, begging him to find her brother's attacker. A few steps further, the Old Thorn patriarch knelt with the same plea. Julian wanted to scream that he didn't know who was behind it. He swore he had no desire to kill Silas. Their pleas weren't really for justice. They had come to believe the rumors. They were there to get him to publicly state that he would not move against their family. Julian, meanwhile, was worried they would move against him. If this incident pushed them to rebellion, he would be in serious trouble. 3 days later, just as Julian had managed to placate the Thorn family, the prisoner escaped from the Justice Ministry, taking the case files with him. It was a complete disaster. Now, he had no way to clear his name. Leland Croft, who had been in seclusion, returned. He dispensed with the formalities of the council hall and cornered Julian in his study, accusing him of courting a reputation as a tyrant. Julian insisted he wasn't trying to eliminate the Thorns. Croft didn't listen, lecturing him on the importance of Silas for border security. Julian lost his temper, demanding to know if Croft really thought him so foolish. The old man looked him in the eye and replied that it wasn't a matter of foolishness. Julian was simply the most likely suspect. His constant clamoring for war made it seem as if the Thorns were obstructing his path to glory. Julian took a deep breath and asked what it would take for Croft to believe him. The old man's answer was immediate. Have a child. That was the last straw. Julian accused Croft of orchestrating the assassination himself, just to pressure him into producing an heir. The old advisor, who had weathered Julian's accusations with stoicism, now broke. He ripped off his ceremonial cap and unleashed a torrent of fury, striking at Julian's deepest wound. He yelled that he was done, that Caleb Frost had been dead for over 3 years, and it was time for Julian to stop wasting his life for him. Was this pathetic display worthy of a chancellor? He demanded to know what Julian had loved so much about Caleb that he would neglect the entire Commonwealth for his memory. What did he love about Caleb? Julian let his mind drift back. He had grown up with him. His grandfather had been a decadent ruler, and his father had been too busy surviving to pay him much attention. At 12, Arthur had sent him to live at the Frost compound, saying that if he himself were killed, Julian might have a chance to escape and one day avenge him. The marshal was busy, and Caleb's older brother had died young. So Julian had become Caleb's shadow. Being his follower required a thick skin. Caleb was taciturn, a fact that didn't bother Julian, who had always been drawn to strength. The real challenge was that one never knew what he would bring home. One night, soon after Julian had moved in, he woke to see Caleb drinking alone on the roof. Julian, young and naive, climbed up to ask what was troubling him. Caleb quickly covered something with his sleeve and told him to go back to bed. Julian persisted, tugging at his sleeve to see what he was hiding. A human head rolled off the roof. Julian's soul went with it. He knew the capital was a dangerous place, with factions settling scores, but he hadn't realized it had reached the point of heads flying through the air. Caleb, seeing his shock, had covered his eyes and sighed, asking why he had to get up and frighten himself. Julian had nightmares for weeks. Caleb, annoyed by his constant nocturnal disturbances, had eventually let him sleep in his room. When that didn't work, he had decided on a more radical therapy. By day, after their lessons with Leland Croft, he would teach Julian to ride and shoot. By night, he would take him along on his assassination missions. It was an unorthodox education. Even Croft had criticized him for it, but Caleb had persisted for 4 years. By the time Julian's father took power, the number of heads on their collective conscience was too high to count. Arthur had always thought of his son as a decorative, simple-minded boy, until the night of his coup. When he saw Julian cut down their uncle, a rival for the throne, without a flicker of hesitation. Caleb had been there, deflecting an arrow meant for Julian. From that day on, Arthur had tacitly approved of them fighting together. For the next decade, they had fought side by side, through the fragmentation of the old Commonwealth and into the dawn of its new prosperity. They had shared glory and stared down death together. When he had nightmares as a boy, it was Caleb who, with gruff tenderness, would pull him close and tell him he was there. After their first mission, when Julian's legs were shaking uncontrollably, it was Caleb who had carried him home, promising he would be safe. On the battlefield, countless times, when he was wounded and on the verge of death, it was Caleb who had stood before him and declared that Julian's life was his to decide. He had loved his impatient gentleness and his arrogant confidence. He couldn't imagine anyone else standing beside him. He remembered the exact moment his feelings had changed. It was after a campaign in the north. At a family dinner, the marshal had told Caleb it was time for him to marry and asked if any of the eligible young women in the capital had caught his eye. Julian, listening, had imagined Caleb with another woman and felt a surge of possessive rage. He glanced over at Caleb and saw him watching him with a knowing expression. Caleb had then turned back to his father and calmly stated that, with the nation still in turmoil and the syndicate a constant threat, he could die on any battlefield. It was unfair to tie a young woman to such a fate. The marshal had argued that was precisely the reason to marry and produce an heir. Caleb had ended the conversation by stating that children have their own fortunes, and without them, he could enjoy his own. The marshal had been ready to explode, but Julian's inner turmoil had subsided. He knew then what he felt. He had acquired the pair of valuable dog tags from his brother and, on Caleb's birthday, had given one to him, pretending he didn't know their significance as a lover's token. Caleb had taken it, a complex expression on his face, but he had kept it. Looking back, Julian realized Caleb had known all along. While Julian was lost in memory, Leland Croft's tirade reached its crescendo. He declared that if Julian continued down this path of lovesick obsession, he could no longer support him. He was resigning. He produced a letter of resignation from his sleeve and threw it on the desk. Julian, his own temper frayed, snatched it up and snarled, "Approved." Croft was stunned. Even Marcus was shocked. After Croft had left, Marcus knelt and begged Julian to reconsider. Julian had just glared at him, asking if he, too, was going to lecture him. Marcus stammered that he wouldn't dare. He didn't have to. The next day, half the council, all former students of Croft, staged a protest, threatening to bash their heads against the ornate pillars of the hall unless Julian reinstated him. Julian, feeling more protective of the pillars than the ministers, told them that if they didn't want to work, they could leave. He banished the two most vocal protesters from the capital. That brought a tense quiet to the government. For a few days, Julian had peace. Then came worse news. The escaped prisoner, along with a new group of assailants, had again tried to kill Silas Thorne. They had also successfully assassinated the two officials Julian had just banished. This time, Silas had been prepared and was unharmed, but the other two were dead. The narrative was now set in stone. The rumors intensified. Julian was purging the Thorne family. The analysis was chillingly logical. He had held Silas in the capital, sent his own guards to kill him, forced out his ally Leland Croft, and now had murdered two of his officials. The banished officials, by a terrible coincidence, were connected to the Thorne family. If not for Julian's direct involvement, how could a few rogue guards evade capture for so long in the capital? Even Julian, listening to the rumors, had to admit they made sense. A pall of fear fell over the city. The Thorne residence became a fortress. Eleanor no longer spoke of her bizarre romantic fantasies. The historian's pens seemed poised to brand him a tyrant. Julian was numb. In that moment, he missed Caleb with an intensity that was physically painful. Caleb was likely the only person in the world who would have trusted him over himself. He recalled the time their fathers had tried to break them up, concocting a ludicrous plot where Arthur would pretend to order the marshal's assassination to create a blood feud between them. They had even staged it, with Julian's men wounding the marshal. The old man had delivered a dramatic speech to Caleb about the ingratitude of power. Caleb had looked at his father's superficial wound, then at the departing assassins, and had asked dryly when he had developed a desire for patricide. He had pointed out that Julian's elite guard, when they acted, left no survivors. How convenient that only the marshal was home and only lightly wounded. He'd finished by telling his father that at his age, he should stop engaging in such foolish schemes with the chancellor. Now, it didn't matter what Caleb had seen in him. All that mattered was that his pact with the Thornes was about to implode. He had two choices: produce an heir with Eleanor to secure their loyalty, or strip them of their military power. Neither was palatable. He was unwilling to do the first, and the second risked destabilizing the southern border. He was still wrestling with this dilemma when his birthday arrived. He left the city and went to the countryside, to the mountain where Caleb's memorial stood. He always came here on this day. But this time, as soon as he left the capital, his eyelid began to twitch. He had a bad feeling. Perhaps the Thornes had decided to strike first. His premonition was correct. As he reached the lodge halfway up the mountain, he noticed an unnatural silence. The usually vibrant forest was devoid of birds and animals. It was the quiet that precedes a tiger's attack. He had only brought a few hundred of his most loyal guards. As he turned to retreat, he heard the thunder of hooves from below. It was over. He was going to die here. He looked down and saw Silas Thorne at the head of a column of cavalry, clad in silver armor and carrying a long spear. The mountain's garrison, loyal to the Thornes, surrendered almost immediately. Julian, in a last, desperate attempt at reason, called out to him, suggesting they could talk. But Silas was not interested in talking. He began to list Julian's crimes, from his reckless warmongering to his dismissal of Leland Croft and the murder of Thorne officials. He concluded that Julian was a degenerate tyrant, unworthy of his office. Julian asked him who he thought was worthy. From behind Silas, Julian's second brother, now grown quite stout, poked his head out. He suggested that perhaps he could fill the role. Julian stared at him. He was truly overreaching. His brother gave a small burp and said that the birthday gift he had arranged was to his liking, he hoped. Silas continued, declaring that Julian's only claim to power was his birthright. Other than that, he was useless. Why was he the chancellor? By what right? Why was he the chancellor? It wasn't just because his father had burned out. It was because 2 years ago, Julian had buried him in memos, painting grand visions of conquering the syndicate and securing the Commonwealth forever. Arthur, exhausted, had offered him a deal. Produce an heir, and he could lead the campaign himself. Julian had refused, calling it blackmail. He had countered by threatening to beat his brothers until one of them produced a suitable heir. His father had lamented his son's choices, wondering how he would face their ancestors. Julian had shot back that his father should be more worried about his own reception in the afterlife, given that he had seized power from his own father. That had been the final straw. Arthur had abdicated, leaving Julian to face the pressure of the council alone. As for his right to rule, as Silas finished his speech and his soldiers began to advance, a volley of arrows rained down from the forest on the mountainside, cutting them down. Silas looked up at Julian in disbelief. Julian smiled. He had told him there was a tiger on the mountain. What truly shattered Silas's composure was the sight of the archers. They were his own southwestern troops, the ones who were supposed to be guarding the border. And leading them was the very captain of the guard Julian had recently dismissed. Silas stared, his eyes wide, and whispered, "How? How indeed? How had Silas's army become Julian's?" Julian, feeling magnanimous, decided to explain. Silas had forgotten, perhaps, that the bulk of his army was once the Frost family's army. Before Silas could process this, another, even more impossible thing happened. Within minutes, his rebellion was crushed. Julian, tired of shouting, retreated into the lodge to drink tea. After 3 cups, the sounds of battle ceased. The captain of the guard yelled that the traitors were trying to set fire to the forest. Julian, unperturbed, took another sip and remarked that arson was a capital offense. The captain dragged him out of the lodge just as a new army appeared at the base of the mountain. Their banner bore a single, stark emblem, the sigil of the Frost family. Julian didn't need to see the man leading them. He knew that face, the high-bridged nose, the piercing eyes that seemed to judge everything they saw. It was the man he had mourned for a year, the general he had sent as an overseer to the south, Caleb Frost. With Caleb's arrival, the last vestiges of the rebellion collapsed. Silas and his co-conspirators were dragged before Julian. Now, seated in the high-backed chair of the lodge, Julian was in the mood to answer his other question. He informed Silas that in the 3rd year of his father's reign, when a northern governor had rebelled and massacred a city, it was he who had personally executed the governor and saved the northern provinces. In the 5th year, when the syndicate invaded and the treasury was empty, it was he who had raised the funds and led the army to defend the south. In the 7th year, during a great drought, when bandits incited a rebellion in the west, it was he who had crushed them and opened the grain stores to feed the people. He paused, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. He told Silas that he asked by what right he ruled. He ruled by the right of 1,000 battles fought and 1,000,000 lives saved. He ruled by the right of a man who had bled to ensure the people of the Commonwealth would never again be prey for foreign powers. He looked at Silas with contempt. unlike him, who had betrayed his country for a handful of syndicate silver. Silas slumped to the floor, defeated. He knew. He had known all along that Silas was the one who had arranged the assassination attempts on him and Caleb. It wasn't difficult to deduce. The attacks were meant to secure control of the Frost Army. One only had to see who benefited from the army's dissolution. After the old northern governor was eliminated, the only major military power left in the region was the Thorn family. Silas hadn't come to rescue them on the mountain all those years ago. He had arrived just after the Marshal's relief force, making it look like a timely intervention when he was really just capitalizing on the situation. And as for Caleb, he had never died. One doesn't fall into the same trap twice. But one can use the trap to fool an enemy. If the syndicate believed that the death of either Julian or Caleb would cripple the Commonwealth, then one of them would die. Now, Caleb had just used the Thorn family's own army to conquer the syndicate. As Julian was savoring his victory, his second brother spoke up, complaining that his older brother had stolen all the glory. Julian shot him a look. The brother quickly added that Julian himself had said that for his birthday this year, the only gift he wanted was a rebellion. It wasn't his idea. With that, he cheerfully dragged the catatonic Silas off to the Ministry of Justice, lecturing him on the idiocy of wanting a job with such long hours. When they were gone, and only he and Caleb remained in the lodge, Julian's eyelid began to twitch again. He looked up to see Caleb watching him with a smile that held no humor. After a moment, Caleb asked if the Chancellor, having finished his grand performance, had anything to say to him. Julian thought for a moment, then closed the distance between them and wrapped his arms around Caleb's waist. He rested his head on his shoulder and said that it was a good thing he had returned when he did. Otherwise, he would have had to live on only in this story's memories. Caleb's body went rigid. Julian. Vance. It was over. He had instigated Silas's rebellion without Caleb's permission. He doubted he would be able to attend the morning council tomorrow. The next day, however, Julian attended the morning council without any issues. The reasons for this were a private matter. He still had to clean house. The old Thorn patriarch, now a prisoner, was unrepentant. He cursed Julian, calling him a petty tyrant who would ruin the Commonwealth. Julian remembered the man's accusations, that he had driven out his friend Leland Croft and murdered his loyal men, forcing his son to rebel. Julian calmly informed him that it was possible Leland had been playing him all along, and that his men had been killed by Croft, not by Julian's order. He wasn't lying. The mastermind behind the elimination of the Thorn loyalists had been the senior advisor. The old Thorn patriarch gaped at him in disbelief. Julian smiled grimly. He asked the old man how he thought Leland Croft had risen from an obscure academic to senior advisor overnight when his father took power. Was it because he was a good debater? Because he was old and grumpy? No. It was because, in his youth, he had been Arthur Vance's chief enforcer. He simply found the act of violence to be uncultured and preferred to delegate. All those heads on his and Caleb's conscience? They were all from Croft's lists. Julian looked at the old man, then at Eleanor and Marcus, who were also present. He pointed out that Croft's 5 sons fought constantly but never dared to defy him. The patriarch had only 2 children, a son he couldn't control and a daughter whose identity as a syndicate agent he had never discovered. The patriarch and Eleanor stared at him. Julian turned his gaze to her. He addressed her by her true name, Swoon. From the moment of their marriage, her goal had been to push Silas on him. Knowing that the humiliation of being offered to a man who preferred men would drive Silas to rebellion. When that failed, she had told Julian about Silas's past treason, his deal with the syndicate, hoping Julian would execute him. With Silas dead, the South would be undefended, and the syndicate could once again dominate the Commonwealth. Her mother, he stated, was a member of the syndicate's ruling family. Wasn't she? He smiled. His Caleb, he said, had brought back a small gift for her from his southern campaign. He had a soldier bring in a covered box and present it to her. Inside was the head of the syndicate's leader, swoon, who had been composed until now broke. She lunged, trying to kill him. Julian sneered. A minor power, puffed up by a slight geographical advantage, had been a nuisance for decades. He was done with them. Finally, he looked at Marcus. He asked the steward what he thought would have happened if he had succeeded in keeping him confined to the capital. Marcus confessed that greed had made him a fool, and he had betrayed the chancellor's trust. Julian nodded, but he also thanked him. His false information, passed to the Thorn Patriarch, had convinced him that Julian was truly at odds with Leland Croft and had been forbidden by his father to attack the syndicate. With the court purged, Julian went to find Caleb, but was told he was with Leland Croft. He went to the senior advisor's residence and found Caleb being subjected to a classic Croft tirade. The old man was yelling that just because he had to use the chancellor as bait on the mountain to clean out the trash in the government didn't mean Caleb had to act as if he had been personally assassinated. Caleb tried to explain, but Croft cut him off, declaring he was done with both of them. He was retiring to the countryside to grow vegetables. Caleb pleaded, but Croft was adamant. He then turned on Caleb, demanding to know what he saw in the chancellor that was worth giving up a family line for. Caleb himself couldn't have said exactly what he saw in Julian Vance. Julian had been a fixture in his life since they were boys. He'd found the child annoying, but the child had thought him the coolest person alive. Of all the royal cousins, Julian was the one whose every other sentence contained Caleb's name. He'd found it pathetic, but couldn't bring himself to be cruel. The boy was just so earnest in his hero worship. When Arthur had sent Julian to live with them, it had gotten worse. He'd been tasked with protecting him. The boy was even clingier. So Caleb, 3 years older and already a master of strategy, had devised a cruel plan. He had deliberately brought the head home, hoping to traumatize Julian into leaving him alone. The result was the opposite. The terrified boy had simply latched on to him tighter, appearing at his door with his small blanket, saying he was scared. It was a mess of his own making, and he had to clean it up. He had let him sleep in his room, and soon Julian was there every night, nightmare or not. He tried taking him on missions, hoping to scare him away for good. Julian had been terrified, his legs shaking, but his first question was always if Caleb was all right. He was hopelessly devoted. And one day, Caleb had looked at him and realized the scrawny boy was now a young man, nearly his own height. And in the years that had passed, he had grown used to his presence. He had started to worry about him when they were apart. He'd first suspected Julian's feelings were more than admiration when the boy, drunk, had declared he wanted to marry him. At the time, Caleb had dismissed it as nonsense. But the idea had taken root. He confirmed his own feelings a few years later, on the campaign where Julian had been gravely wounded. Seeing Julian pale and bleeding, the only thought in Caleb's mind was that heaven wasn't jealous of his talent. It was jealous that Caleb had such a beautiful man to love. The thought of a world without Julian, without his constant presence, was suffocating. In that moment, he had sworn to himself that if Julian lived, he would grant him anything. But Julian had lived, and Caleb had lost his nerve. He had never spoken the words, but he had allowed their intimacy to grow. He'd even accepted the dog tag. He had never responded because Julian was the heir, the future chancellor. He was supposed to marry, to have children. Caleb feared that if he acknowledged their love, It would break them both, leaving them in a place where they could be neither brothers nor partners. It was better not to begin. But Julian, even without a word of encouragement, had resisted all pressure for him. It was Caleb who had finally insisted he marry Eleanor Thorne, arguing he couldn't focus on the Southern campaign if he was worried about the Thornes causing trouble at his back. Julian had reluctantly agreed. On his wedding night, he had snuck out of the residence and come to Caleb, complaining that his new wife was a weirdo who wanted to set him up with her brother. Caleb, despite having pushed for the marriage for strategic reasons, had found himself feeling ungenerous. He had pushed Julian away, telling him that his bed had been occupied by another, and he wouldn't have him back until the bed was replaced. Julian had looked crushed, but had promised to build a new one with his own hands. Caleb watched as Julian now entered Croft's study, saw the old man was about to leave, and immediately launched into his own smooth-tongued argument. He clasped the senior advisor's hand, telling him that it was better to be a self-made man than to raise children who would only bother you in the afterlife asking for your blessing. Croft, looking from Julian's earnest face to Caleb's amused one, threw up his hands in disgust. He told Caleb to control his man. Caleb just smiled. He looked at Julian, his eyes glittering. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice dropping to a low purr that was for Julian alone. "Speaking of which, when will our bed be ready?" Croft looked between them, a sudden understanding dawning on his face. He pointed a trembling finger at the door. "Both of you out. Out."